Hey there, folks. I'm not emotionally well, but I'm still here with another album review, and today I wanted to talk about the new Cindy Lee record, Diamond Jubilee. This review is going to be notably less structured than most of my other reviews, with a lot more rambling going on that barely has connection with this record. But just trust me on this one. It'll all tie itself together in the end. Probably, kinda. Promising start, I know. So let me just sort of preface this review by not even talking about the album I'm discussing today itself, but rather records like Diamond Jubilee. Sometimes I forget why I'm so passionate about music and why so many people like myself are passionate about music, and I think that's pretty normal in terms of the arts or just interests people have in general, going through a brief drought of just not really being interested in something as much as you were at one point. And for myself personally, it usually takes me listening to a monumentally impactful record to really change that for me, and that sounds like it means that I go through months on end of not being interested in music. And while that's happened like once to me, generally speaking, I just go back to an old personal favorite, and that tends to kind of kick me back into gear, so to speak. A record that sort of changed my perspective on music in some way, or I feel I've deeply connected with emotionally in some way over time. The kind of records that make me feel, the kind of records that make me passionate about music anytime that I feel like I'm maybe starting to lose my grip on things. I mean, personally, I would like to think that I'm an individual who's pretty on the pulse across a variety of different genres as far as new releases go, but it's records like Leonard Cohen's Songs of Love and Hate, maybe my favorite album of all time that I go back to. That's a record that's reliably stuck by my side over time. The Avalanches' Since I Left You, a record that completely reinvented the way that I viewed production, the way I viewed beat making, the way I viewed sampling. A record like Ween's Quebec, arguably, at least in my eyes, the greatest achievement of any quote unquote alternative rock band in the history of the genre from a creative standpoint. Kleenex Girl Wonder's Ponyoke and its Beatles-esque melodies perfected noisy pop music for me, and Clipping's Visions of Bodies Being Burned created some of the most visceral atmospheres and some of the most brutal lyricism I've ever had the pleasure of hearing in my entire life. Those are just some of the records that I could possibly name right now. I could spend an entire hour talking about albums that mean a lot to me in terms of shaping the way that I approach music today. But more importantly, those are the albums that I connect with the most, my personal masterpieces, if you will. Of course, subjectivity comes into play here. Not every single one of the albums that I just mentioned you're going to love. You might hate all of them, or you might love all of them. But for me personally, they are the records that certainly over time have changed the way that I viewed things. To put it bluntly, in a way that may not necessarily sound particularly favorable towards those records, those are old reliable albums for me. Records that I've known about and have been listening to for years at this point. Albums that I've spent a lot of time with. And hey, maybe you could say the same thing for, well, literally anything else just about. Maybe it's a car seat headrest album, maybe it's an anime OST, maybe it's a comedy album from someone like Neil Hamburger, who knows? Just a record that in some way or another you feel a personal connection with, something that is consistently in your rotation and rarely, if ever, leaves, something that you just feel is important to you on a personal level. And those records that are almost kind of desert island records, if you will, are the albums that do bring me back to feeling passionate about music. But more importantly, because of the time that I spend with them personally, I always get this sense of almost yearning about them. And that yearning feeling that I get from those kind of records tends to only come many months, if not entire years, after I first find myself listening to them, because you build up a sort of relationship with these albums over time, listening to them both critically and casually, listening to them in a variety of settings, in a variety of moods, at a variety of points in my personal growth. And hey, maybe call it a personal insecurity about my own existence, or I don't know, maybe you could say that it's an insecurity about the time that I admittedly gladly waste listening to way more music than any normal human being probably honestly should. But I really do feel like there is something powerful in kind of building up this history with a record and allowing that to impact you on an emotional level. It's a constant reminder for myself, at least, of what it means to connect with a work that was meticulously put together by another human being on this planet, as well as a reminder that we are all, in some way or another, ultimately capable of creating work that connects with people on an emotional level in the same way that those albums connect with us. Every listen that we give, even the most casual background music tier listens that we give to the records that we cherish more than all other albums that we've heard, are examples of us being able to add to our history with that album while also being a reminder of the history that's already been written with that album. Maybe an album soundtracked a part of your life that was particularly meaningful. Maybe an album really connected with you when you were in a dark place in life. Or maybe an album just reflected a particularly great moment in your life. Anything like that. I would even go as far as to argue that the times and memories and emotions that we associate with music extend well beyond the creative intent that any artist put into it, and ultimately that is what matters more than the impact of the sound of the music itself. I don't care if the Germs couldn't play more than like 2 or 3 chords. I still get a little emotional about it, with them being one of the earliest punk bands that I ever heard. That's not even one of my favorite bands, but still, they connect with me on that level. And I really do think in that manner, albums that we've known and have been listening to for years upon years upon years upon years are the kind of albums that tend to elicit the strongest emotional reactions out of us. It sounds obvious, but I don't think it's really something that myself or most people think about when listening to an album that they've known for an extended period of time. But all of the albums, all of the artists, all of the different pieces of music that I've named in this review up to this point that aren't Diamond Jubilee are records that I've known about for years at this point. Albums that have been with me since I was a little kid and first got into music when I was like 7 or 8 years old. These are pieces of music that I have had time to build up a history with, and as such, I can confidently say, man, the Dead Kennedys are one of my favorite bands because not only are they great, but they also made California Über Alles, the first song that I really remember falling in love with on my own. So, with that being said, I have to ask myself, how is it that Diamond Jubilee, a record that as of right now has been out for less than a month, can elicit the same feelings in me that only certain records that I've known about and have been listening to for years can? It doesn't feel like it should be possible, but it somehow is. Listen, I'm not usually the type of person to need a huge amount of time to fully develop my thoughts and opinions on a record that it becomes ready to put into a script and upload to YouTube or upload a review to Rate Your Music. I feel like, generally speaking, it's a maximum of a couple of weeks before I've been able to fully develop my thoughts beyond just the initial, I like this, or this sucks. And, of course, those thoughts are bound to change and kind of, heighten, lessen as time goes on. Those opinions that I have on records that I really like one year may be different, and I may not dig it as much 5 years down the line. Or a record I don't like at first, I may suddenly really start liking a few years into the future, etc., etc. That nearly goes without saying, but the point still stands that, generally speaking, it doesn't take me long to decide, at least in full, my fleshed out initial thoughts on a record. So why did it take me nearly a month, as well as taking about a week and a half off, I believe, maybe longer, from this YouTube channel to properly review Diamond Jubilee? I gave this record a first listen a couple of days after it initially dropped at the tail end of March, expecting to give it maybe 2-3 listens and do a review on it, considering there was a lot of hype around it. And since then, I've been convinced that I couldn't really fully describe my feelings about it. In that time, this record has honestly taken up the majority of the time that I've spent listening to full-length albums with a critical ear, and it's even taken up a fair chunk of my casual listening time as well, when I put on music in the background while I'm doing whatever else of importance. After all of those sessions of listening and experiencing it in various different settings, various different moods, various different points of time, I feel like I can't help but find myself consistently greeted by this strange sense of warm melancholy that so few records manage to achieve upon first listen, and even fewer records manage to achieve constantly with the same degree of strength upon multiple listens, let alone like 10. Even for people that are unlike myself in that they don't feel the need to just ramble their thoughts out into the internet anytime they hear a record that they find themselves passionate about in one way or another, it's very easy to determine whether an album is meant to be wistful and heartstring tugging or not. It's a pretty easily identifiable factor, and I would say it's just as easy to determine whether or not a record works for you in that regard. I mean, it's not that hard to decide if an album sounds good to your ears or not at the end of the day, and as long as you aren't letting yourself be swayed by another individual's opinion in some way or another, it's pretty easy to find yourself directly deciding if an album sounds like it works for you or not, which is why I find it so shocking that Diamond Jubilee, an album that was so extremely hyped up in so many circles that I do actively participate in, still managed to overwhelm me and still manages to feel a little bit underrated, even with just this total complete unraveling of the very concept of nostalgia being instilled throughout the entirety of its runtime, something that is so very painfully but beautifully obvious from the very first moments that you listen to it. From the opening seconds of the album opening title track to the closing moments of the final track on this record, 24/7 Heaven, Diamond Jubilee is sort of willingly taking hold of the past and watching it very majestically crumble into dust in a way that I don't think I've ever heard another record achieve, at least to the same grand degree that this record often does alongside its epic runtime and 32-track length. And I really do think that this album manages to be something that is simultaneously based around revivalism to an extent, yet entirely distinct from anything in the past or the present, or maybe even the future. I mean, this is a record that throughout its entire runtime feels shrouded in mystery from an atmospheric standpoint, while still being a tender approach to sounds that would honestly be extinct if it weren't for contemporary interest in a lot of neo-futuristic revivalism of mid-20th century experimental pop music. And in that way, this almost feels like an album that doesn't exist at all, distinctly modern, yet still heavily from the past at the same time. Almost like this is a record that just exists in a place and time that was never really real in the first place. The soundtrack to a spring night on a day in a year somewhere between like 1956 and 1962 that just somehow faded from the history books over time. A time period that isn't real. That's what this album sounds like. I mean, track after track throughout this record, Cindy Lee are presenting the world of Diamond Jubilee, a record that kind of has this overarching soundscape that feels simultaneously completely fictitious and viscerally real at the same time, almost like the ghost of past music embracing some of the sounds of the modern-day alternative scene in a combination that sounds like nothing that belongs to either period. Similar feelings of peculiar, almost non-existent beauty are reflected in a lot of Diamond Jubilee's songwriting. When the words, "I looked around and what did I see? Stone faces looking back at me" are sung, there's this brief sense of spectacle that emerges where the few people who did work on this record are placing the narrator on some sort of grand stage for this very brief minor moment on this record. This is an album that sounds cold, that sounds lonely, and in that brief moment there's this feeling where there is a semblance of humanity beyond the actual vocal work here, except that it's just stone faces and that there's no connection with the rest of the world being built here. It's a totally isolationist record in that manner, and after those few lines, for the most part throughout this album, it proceeds to once again sink back into the obscure dimension that it initially came from in the first place. But in those brief couple of lines, there's this sort of world that is created in Diamond Jubilee that gains a sense of character in a way, because not only does in those two lines break the isolated mood of this record, it also kind of feels almost a bit accusatory in a way, almost like the narrator dared to try and break away from a lot of the melancholy and wistful feelings that you get throughout the majority of this record. It's so simple how there's just two lines here in that particular track. There are more lyrics to that track, but those two lines in particular, it's so simple how those two lines manage to add so much to the overall soundscape. And honestly, I could spend all day talking about what lyrical content you can actually fully make out here, because it really does add to a lot of the atmospherics and general tones found throughout the majority of this record. Later on the track Don't Tell Me I'm Wrong, you see the chorus sort of hijack the loneliness of Diamond Jubilee for the sake of being used as its own unique device, with the lines, "Don't tell me I'm wrong, without you close to me, all I've got is this song and your memory." And it's this balance of wholesome, undying love and the emotional suffering that comes from the increasing distance, either physically or emotionally, between two individuals that is deeply present at various points in this record, as is the aforementioned isolationist tendencies that you see pop up throughout a lot of this album, something that can be largely attributed to the songwriting, where the narration predominantly addresses exclusively one's own thoughts. And in that way, it feels like a deeply personal album, despite the epic runtime and nature of a lot of the compositional work here. I would say that the latter especially rings true throughout Diamond Jubilee, as I think that one could aptly describe the vast majority of the songwriting on this album as one's own foggy-minded thoughts on a particularly chilly night while you're taking a stroll. It's a record that lacks any distinct connection with anything or anyone else, yet at the same time feels so desperate to have that, and in a sense it feels so easy to be moved by this album. It feels so honest and genuine. All of that set aside, the songwriting and vocals here still manage to feel indistinct in the best way that they possibly could, because rather than being the sort of leading charismatic role of a record in a manner that would be seen as more traditional by the general standards of popular music, the vocals throughout Diamond Jubilee are just yet another layer in the absurd degree of dynamics that are taken up throughout this whole album's runtime. And I mean, the songwriting itself is, of course, in particular, something very special, and something that honestly could be said about most qualities of Diamond Jubilee, is that it is very special. But I really do feel like the songwriting here is something to look out for in particular. But the manner in which the vocals sort of add this semi-psychedelic overtone to an already dense record is something that makes listening to Cindy Lee with an active present ear so worth it, so much more worth it. This is a record that is instrumentally, tonally beautiful, but I feel like the vocals really do add a lot here in terms of creating this world that feels somehow cold yet whimsical at the same time. It's an album with an atmosphere that I don't think is like anything else out there right now. Being an album with a lot of influences pretty deeply rooted in an extremely specific time period of pop music, the sort of mid-50s through early 60s experimental pop scene, as I stated earlier in this review, many of the production techniques of that aforementioned time period are present throughout this record, but at the same time, Diamond Jubilee never feels unnecessarily rooted in the past or anything like that, nor does it feel modern either. Like I said, it feels like something else entirely, and I particularly enjoy how a lot of these classic styles of production are being utilized throughout this record to create something that feels so emotionally striking and subtle. I would say that much of Diamond Jubilee in terms of sonic presentation could kind of be compared to two of the greatest producers of that time period, Phil Spector and Joe Meek. The lush instrumentation and strings of Spector's iconic signature wall of sound style is pretty omnipresent throughout Diamond Jubilee, yet there remains this certain uncanny quality that remains a bit more reminiscent of Meek's space age pop neo-futuristic sci-fi style of pop music of the time period that feels just as important here. It's this sort of brand of looking at the future that never came that I think was very much relevant during that time period and feels oddly relevant now in a way, now that we really are in the future that the 1950s and 60s did not envision whatsoever, that it kind of feels sort of melancholy throughout this record, almost like you're getting a view in terms of sonic style of what the future was meant to look like in the eyes of these individuals who died decades ago. And here we are in the present with a future that looks so wildly different from what a lot of those predictions were. And it just feels so dissonant in the best way possible. Not the music itself, but dissonant with reality in a way. Almost like this is music that came from an alternate timeline where those predictions actually happened to come out correct. If you will excuse me for paraphrasing LCD Sound System's James Murphy on Losing My Edge here, Diamond Jubilee can often feel like borrowed nostalgia for the unremembered late 50s and early 60s, but even yet, the term unremembered feels like a very loose term, a very vague term to use in this context, because this isn't just taking ideas from a particular time. This feels like something else entirely, because Diamond Jubilee is not a record that could have existed back then, and it barely feels like an album that can exist now. It nearly feels like Cindy Lee went into an alternate timeline where Les Baxter's space escapades and the Tornadoes' Telstar, The Sounds of the Tornadoes, replaced Sgt. Pepper's and Pet Sounds as the most influential pop albums of all time, and then went to that version of 2024 to bring back to our world some of the biggest hits of that alternate dimension, if that even makes sense. It's so difficult to describe this record without coming up with hypothetical situations where this record sounds like it belongs, because at present moment, in the present day, I don't think there is a single other record out there that, in my eyes, sounds anything like this. There are certainly plenty of records that you could argue achieve similar feelings. There's a lot of shoegaze out there that can be very impactful and melancholy in the same way that this album is. There are plenty of more singer-songwriter oriented albums that I'm sure can elicit the same feelings for a lot of people. But at the end of the day, the way that Diamond Jubilee presents itself as an album that feels completely outside of time and space is something that feels so unique and so special and so unlike anything else I've heard this year or maybe even ever. It would be so easy for me to just start this review and say, oh, Diamond Jubilee is an album that takes a lot of influences from sounds of another era and reworks them in a way that is arguably less groundbreaking than it was, say, 70 years ago, but is nonetheless deeply interesting, and just leave it at that. But I feel like that would be doing this record a complete and total disservice, because I almost feel like that's not necessarily an accurate depiction of what this album is. Sure, it wears its influences on its sleeve, no doubt, but at the same time, it's this combination of these different influences with this yearning melancholy and this undying sense of hope and suffering at the same time being put into play here that feels so extremely important almost in the modern day, the sort of post-pandemic era of the internet age, if you will. And I think I speak for a lot of people out there, or maybe I just speak for myself when I say that at the present moment, it's been harder than ever to feel directly connected with people in general. I'm not necessarily trying to, complain about anything here or anything like that, but I really do feel like this record is very much reflective of a lot of the loneliness and a lot of the coldness that many people across the planet feel at the moment due to varying events going on across the globe. And I feel like Diamond Jubilee, maybe it's not the album of a generation or anything like that, but it may very well be the album that I've heard that captures that feeling the most, that feeling of complete and total isolation. The way that the record just suddenly cuts off without any sort of grand finale or fade out, which is admittedly the only quality of the record that did take some time to grow on me, is jarring, but at the same time it makes sense. It took some time for it to make sense to me, but it makes sense now. It's this moment where it feels like our connection with whatever world this album is somehow coming from is cut off just as suddenly as it appeared in the first place. And if this is truly meant to be the final Cindy Lee album, then the cutoff of this record is the cutoff of an amazing, brutally underrated career and a stunning record that I think truly is one of the most impressive artistic achievements of the decade and maybe even the century so far. Put succinctly, Diamond Jubilee feels like the popular music of another dimension colliding with the looming emotional apocalypse that so many of us feel when looking at the current state of the world, to make for something that feels wholly unique in a way that I truly mean unique when I describe it. I don't think this sounds like anything else out there. And truly, if you are watching this and if you've made it this far into my delusional rambles about this album, and you think you've heard some stuff sort of like this record, I'm begging you to please recommend it to me. Send it to me in the comments, recommend it to me on my Twitter, send it to me in a DM on rateyourmusic.com. I truly don't care. I would just love to hear another album that sounds anything like this. I will say I do think that this record's connection with a period of popular music that has a long since passed certainly does have something to do with those melancholy feelings that do arise throughout the entirety of the record, that warm melancholy of falling in love with an era that will never happen again. But at the same time, it's the complete and total singular way that this record presents all of its sounds, and all of the sounds throughout it managing to be somehow non-existent feeling in terms of how uncanny, how liminal they often feel, how ethereal they feel. It just makes for one of the most intensely moving albums I think I've ever heard, honestly. Being an evenly numbered 32 songs long and running for just over 2 hours, listening to Diamond Jubilee from front to back is a journey, and it's one that you might not even be emotionally prepared for. I know personally I was not expecting to be as deeply moved by this album upon first listen as I ultimately was, and honestly, I still kind of can't really believe how powerful I find this album to be, even as I'm going into double digits of listens at this point. Throughout this record, themes of nostalgia, isolation, existentialism, love, heartbreak, and melancholy are explored in a way that feels entirely one of a kind in the modern music landscape, while also beautifully reshaping what it means to pay homage to an era of music that has since come to pass. I don't think it's any secret that that sort of thing has become increasingly popular in recent years, with a lot of classic 80s synth pop revival and a lot of classic 70s and even late 60s hard rock revival, among various other things going on. But I really do think that you can't get more genuine than taking an era of music and completely ripping it out of its own time and turning it into something that barely feels like it belongs anywhere, just like Diamond Jubilee does here. More than anything, though, Diamond Jubilee, and maybe it's just because I was in a somewhat sensitive place and time when I first listened to this record, makes me question, what does it mean to really fall in love with music, to fall in love with art? Is it connecting with a record from a compositional standpoint and finding enjoyment in the musical intricacies of an album? Is it embracing the raw expression of another person as they artistically convey the feelings and thoughts that so many of us, including myself, can't generally find the ideas or words to properly express? Or is it merely just because, hey, some sounds are good to our ears and others are bad, and we as humans tend to gravitate towards the ones that we find good? And at the end of the day, I don't think that there's a true answer to that. I think that maybe there's just a sort of case-by-case basis answer you can give there, but I don't think there's one true overarching answer there to be found. Maybe there is some sort of universal truth in there about how we all connect with art, various pieces of art, for the same reasons, in the same ways, just with our own unique approaches to, taking on that connection. But at this point in time, I don't think I really need an answer, as it would maybe take away from some of the unfiltered, shimmering beauty of some of the records that I truly do consider my personal favorites, now including Diamond Jubilee. And this all leads me back to the question that I posed at the very beginning of this review, roughly, which is, why is it that Diamond Jubilee is able to elicit within myself the same feelings that most records can only achieve after months, if not years, of me listening to them and connecting with them in some way or another? And to tell the truth, I have no idea. Listen, I'm not a philosopher, I'm not a scientist, I don't know how different music affects people's brains differently. I barely understand how music affects my own brain half the time. Hell, I barely understand myself in general. But with all of that being said, I don't think I really care at this point. I spent a couple of weeks prior to listening to this record for the first time wondering why it is that I do this, why I have a YouTube channel, why I consistently listen to music and write reviews and upload videos talking about those albums with those reviews being used as scripts, etc., etc. Just wondering why. And I don't have an answer. And I don't want one. I don't need one, because I've realized that it just makes me happy and it moves me. And this album, Diamond Jubilee, moves me more than I think anything I've heard in a long, long time does. All I really know at this point is that Diamond Jubilee is an ethereal masterpiece. It's a record that brings me devastating waves of joy and pain in a way that so few records have ever managed to bring me, and I absolutely adore it for that. And if this is Cindy Lee's proper send-off, the final Cindy Lee record, then it is a career finale for the absolute ages. I mean, think about all of the great official final albums that you've heard from bands that you love. Fugazi's The Argument, David Bowie's Black Star, Nick Drake's Pink Moon, A Tribe Called Quest, We've Got It From Here. Even an album like maybe even, say, Joy Division's Closer, for example. The kind of albums that not only define the final moments of a career, but manage to create a sort of mythos around those individual records in particular that feels so deeply powerful and melancholy due to the final nature of them. I think that this belongs up there in those ranks already. I know that's maybe a bold statement, maybe even a slight exaggeration to an extent considering recency bias, but with all of that being set aside, all of those albums that are those stunning final records, albums by bands and artists that you know you'll never hear from again unless you choose to revisit their catalog, I think if this is the final Cindy Lee record, at least for the time being, that this is truly up there among the great final albums throughout music history. Diamond Jubilee doesn't feel real, and even roughly a month after its initial release, I still kind of have a sneaking suspicion that I've just been extensively lucid dreaming one of the most stunning albums that I've ever had the distinct pleasure of having heard, or alternatively, one of the few albums that's ever inspired me to write and record a review this rambling and tedious, but until I wake up from that lucid dream, I will happily keep Diamond Jubilee on repeat for eternity, just about. This is the first time that I've done this, I believe, in nearly 2 years, but I'm going to give this record 5 stars out of 5. With that being said, that is the end of this album review, if you can even really call this a proper review. And, yeah, that's it. I have nothing more to say. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one.